Hello, my brothers and sisters in the Lord. Today we are starting a new book in the Old Testament, the book of Judges, and we're covering chapters 1, 2, and 3. You're going to recognize, as we read through Judges, there's some pretty wild stories in this book, and to me it is always a reminder of the very last verse in the book that says, in those days Israel had no king and everyone was doing as they saw fit. And you're going to recognize that becomes a theme throughout the book. So just go back, go look at that verse in the back of the book, and then come back and start reading. And you're going to notice something else in the book of Judges. There is a repeated pattern in this book. The pattern goes a little bit like this, depending how you describe it. It could be 3 or 4 parts, but basically it goes like this. We're on the heels of Joshua and the leaders that followed him, and they did so well. The people were following the Lord. And then here comes this pattern. They forsake the Lord. Then the Lord sends oppressors or allows oppressors, however you want to word that. And then God raises up a rescuer to bring them out of that oppression. And then they find the Lord, they celebrate the Lord, and then number 4, they slip back again. And then again, they forsake the Lord. He sends some oppression, raise a rescuer, and the pattern repeats itself at least 12 times in the book of Judges. And you can see it 2 times in today's reading already. Let me give you an example out of chapter 2. In chapter 2, verse 12, it says they forsook the Lord. And it talks about them following idols. And then in verse 14, it says the Lord handed them over to raiders. And you can see pattern number 2. And one way, let me just say something. We're not always sure when the Lord hands someone over to oppression, is it the Lord doing it? I often think of it like his hand is reaching down. And we don't always know, is his hand like disciplining them? Or is his hand just being removed and his favor is gone and they're exposed to the void of his protection? We're not always sure. But either way, the bad things are happening because of that, and the Lord is in full control of that. Okay, so they forsake him. Verse 14, he hands them over to raiders. And then if we look in 2 verse 16, the Lord raises up a judge. And here comes the rescuer. And then it doesn't take very long. By the time you get to verse 19, the people have already returned to the ways even more corrupt than their forefathers, and the pattern repeats itself. And you think, if you look in chapter 3, you'll see the same thing in short order, even with Othniel. In 3 verse 7 and 9 and so on, they forget the Lord. And in verse 8, he sold them into the hand of the Cushites, or the king of Aram, sorry. And then in verse 9, he raises up a deliverer. And by the time you get to verse 12, once again, they forget the Lord. Church, when you read that pattern, you might be tempted to say, man, what is wrong with these Israelites? How could they do that? That would never happen to us today, would it? Let's just slow down a little bit. What are the people forgetting the Lord by doing? Tolerating the worship of other gods. A verse in the New Testament like Colossians 3 would say that something like greed is actually idolatry. That's one sin out of many. That in itself is already idolatry. How many people in North America do you know that have no temptation to struggle with greed? Not very many. That is idolatry, church, and it creeps into our lives. I don't know that we're that much different. And he sends oppressors. And if you think it's harsh for God to be sending oppression, and you think Jesus of the New Testament would never do that, you should read in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, there's at least 2 different examples where God not only allows oppression, it says he actually fights against the people in his church if they are going to do exactly these things and follow other gods and pretend to be following Jesus. Church, this applies to us today. And then he raises up a leader. And we see in the New Testament, God often uses human leaders, yes, but ultimately this is pointing to Jesus that they need as a leader. They need ultimately Jesus to be their king. And church, we have Jesus. These Israelite people don't know, they don't understand, they don't have that same understanding yet, and we do, and we still fall into this pattern. And then in their freedom, have you ever experienced that? You get close to Jesus, you confess some sin, you feel like now you're cruising, right? And what happens? It happens again. Church, you could ask the Lord this question: is there a pattern of sin in my life? And Lord, what steps could I take to mitigate that? And then you'll recognize there's something really powerful in the end of chapter 2. I'm going to say verse 22. And then also twice in chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, you'll notice the word test is there several times. And here is actually a beautiful thing. According to James chapter James chapter 1, we know that God does not tempt anybody. Okay? But does he test people? Yes. But when he tests people, it's not a bad thing. He's not trying to make them fail. He's actually setting up for them an opportunity for them to prove or demonstrate that they are submitting to him as Lord and Savior and putting their trust in him. It's actually a wonderful thing. And what's he doing here in chapter 3, verse 2? He is actually teaching them warfare, because they might be of a generation that hasn't already learned and experienced it for themselves. And so the same thing applies for us today, church. Every generation doesn't get to only build on the foundation of the previous generation. You might be blessed with a foundation of leaders that have been really good, but even you and your generation need to learn these things. Like 2 Corinthians 10 would point us to, we need to learn spiritual warfare tactics. We need to engage in those things, and sometimes God even allows a difficulty or a hardship in our life just so that we can verify and prove, yes, we trust the Lord. Yes, Lord. And you could even ask a question like this: Lord, is there a difficulty that you've allowed in my life in order to test me in the way to prove my obedience? Or maybe ask you, would you equip me to fight spiritual warfare? Ask the Lord what a tactic is that he would have, a spiritual weapon you could use. And the first one you can use, there's two of them: praise and prayer. Why don't you start there today? Enjoy your day with Jesus.